Kick drops in and the pace snaps tighter. Steps move slow but the groove grows brighter. Hands tap once and they fall in line. One clean hit and the track feels fine. Clock drags back but the bass cuts steady. Mind floats off but my pulse stays ready. Weight climbs high but I don't break through. Drop hits clean and I rise on cue. Keep that time and hold that lane. Pull the rhythm back again. If the line drifts out of frame, lock it in and set the aim. Crank the tempo, crank, crank, crank. Crank the tempo, crank, crank, crank. Crank the tempo, crank, crank, crank. Crank that tempo, crank, crank. Crank the tempo, crank, crank, crank. Crank the tempo, crank, crank, crank. Crank the tempo, crank, crank, crank. Crank that tempo, crank, crank. Lights fade low but the beat hits deeper. Steps trace lines like a silent sweeper. Hands slow down and the kick snaps back. Drop lands once and it clears the track. Thoughts slip out but the flow stays fluent. Stress climbs quick but the sound cuts through it. I stay sharp when the push comes soon. Head nods twice, locked in tune. Keep that time and hold that lane. Pull the rhythm back again. If the line drifts out of frame, lock it in and set the aim. Crank the tempo, crank, crank, crank. Crank the tempo, crank, crank, crank. Crank the tempo, crank, crank, crank. Crank the tempo, crank, crank. Crank the tempo, crank, 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 crank. Stay alive when the pace turns thin. Beat pulls close and it draws me in. Even when the drag slips back again. Crank that tempo, start again. Crank, crank the tempo, crank, crank, crank. Crank, crank the tempo, crank, crank, crank. Crank, crank the tempo, crank, crank, crank. Crank the tempo, crank, crank. Crank, crank the tempo, crank, crank, crank. Crank, crank the tempo, crank, crank, crank. Crank, crank the tempo, crank, crank, crank. Crank the tempo, crank, crank. Kick hits first, I lock my stride. Sharp tap sync with the workday tie. Desk like lead, but my pace feels right. Hands tap quick on the left to right. Click through tasks like a coded line. Pose jumps twice on the bass incline. Loop comes back like a boomerang trap. Mind snaps in when the kick rolls back. Same 4 steps but the beat rewinds. Same quick snap in the preset lines. Run that pad till the drive ignites. Loop turns on and the whole room bites. Loop, loop, hit it when it snaps. Loop, loop, run it on the map. Loop, loop, keep it tight and flat. Loop, loop, never losing track. Loop, loop, push it clean and bright. Loop, loop, cut the left and right. Loop, loop, feel the W smack. Loop, loop, bring the tempo back. Sun fades low but the loop stays prime. Feet tap fast on the deadline climb. Buzz won't quit but I cut that chime. Flow stays sharp in the overtime. Same short bars but the push feels light. Kick hits clean with a neon bite. Move in place like a clockwork snap. Hit that beat with a quick back tap. Same 4 steps but the beat rewinds. Same quick snap in the preset lines. Run that pad till the drive ignites. Loop turns on and the whole room bites. Loop, loop, hit it when it snaps. Loop, loop, run it on the map. Loop, loop, keep it tight and flat. Loop, loop, never losing track.